in is the conditions under which dancers work.
Wow.
And you've concentrated on injury questions in your own research, but over and beyond that, and we could talk about that, there's the whole question of how do they make a living today, and how do they put a portfolio of work together, just from your own experience of working with so many dancers?
How do we put the portfolio? That's quite an interesting question, which I'm not sure I can answer.
Well, I can ask you a different one.
But, okay, so, are we talking about, there are different kind of groups of dancers, so you could be talking on the one hand about company dancers, and on the other you can talk about the majority of dancers who are probably independent dance artists, if you like. Company dancers usually have a much better deal than independent dancers because they have some kind of support in relation to injury, for example. They might have physiotherapists on tap, or they may have access to physiotherapy, or other kinds of treatments. Although, actually, I have to say that one company that didn't join in our research, when I spoke to some of the dancers just informally at a very different context, did say that they understood why they didn't join in the research as the company, because actually the conditions for dealing with injury were not that terrific within that particular company. This is a big national company. So it does vary, and I think for independent dancers, which actually there is a kind of independent dance organisation which is run out of Siobhan Davis's studio in South London, headed by the wonderful Jill Clark, who was an amazing dancer herself and worked with Sue Davis for quite a long time. So independent dancers will, generally speaking, be almost like jobbing dancers. They're a bit like what happened in the media in the 1990s, when there was a kind of declassification, if you like, and you get a lot of contract workers coming out. I suppose in many ways dancers have been like that always. I know, for example, that Martha Graham's dancers or Doris Humphrey's dancers in the early 20th century, when modern dance was developing, would have actually been waitressing, doing other jobs while they were doing dance, because there's no money in dance. So,
and that continues now.
That continues
now
for the majority of dancers. They will normally be employed sporadically on contract basis, and often they will have to, if they bring a group together themselves, they would have to perhaps pay the theatre in order to perform. So they have to kind of coordinate themselves quite well. And I guess that they are in a very difficult position, much more so, I think, than other performing art forms.
How sustainable is that kind of career? To what sort of age? Given that, would it be right to say that the majority of dancers are women, or would that not be right?
No, the majority of dancers are women. There was an old rule that said, if you're a man, you can put one foot in front of the other, you're in, actually. But I think, actually, there are many more men training now. But still, the ratio is much more female. It's very much a female performing art, although, strangely enough, most of the major choreographers are men.
So
still,
typically, what sorts of work would people be doing to, if you like, support the creative activity that keeps them really motivated?
Well, they would probably do class. They'd probably hire a studio if they were not just performers, but actually were creative artists, in inverted commas. I'm not suggesting that performers are not in themselves creative artists, because I think they are. But if they wanted to develop a piece of choreography, they would hire a studio and they would work on that basis. They probably work with dancers that they know very well, and whose bodies they know quite well, and those dancers will know what that creative artist might want from them because of the way in which they work. And then they would perhaps be able to perform someplace, but sometimes they can't. And so their wages are actually very low.
Yes.
It's very hot here.
Try and turn the radio.
I just feel as though I'm going to explode. Sorry.
We're going to have the outtakes.
Shall I open the... yeah.
I just felt this heat coming up. And I purposely put on this really jumper because I'm about...
You'll be complaining about
I will be complaining about the noise, and you'll be complaining about the noise.
If you want, I can open one of the other windows.
You might get quite a lot of noise actually. You might have to.
Yeah, there's a bit of, you can get the rumbles.
You probably will.
I think I've just turned this, I'll just let a wee bit of air out.
Yeah. Yeah, I could feel it from here a little bit as well, so.
We had been into electric theatre this morning, which is absolutely freezing because of the air conditioning, but we all sit with our coats on and our hats and our gloves. So, sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Is that a bit better now?
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
It's okay? Right. Okay.
So, my colouring will change.
I'll have to colour me. Take the red out of these laser shots.
That would be good.
So, just to get back to this hot topic, then, how long can dancers sustain that kind of portfolio career? Do you think
they sustain it until they hang up their shoes or whatever? And generally speaking, they're out of the business by about 34. That is the same for women actors, actually, because I've done quite a lot of work on that too. And they tend to go out of the business much earlier than the men do. But given that dance is, generally speaking, a kind of female occupation, they will go out of the business. And sometimes they do other things. They will, quite a lot of them go into different body technique trainings like Pilates, for example, or Alexander technique or Feldenkrais or something like that. So they're still working, perhaps working with dancers, but they themselves are not performing. And it's often they go into those areas because of injuries. And there are a lot of those.
And given the generally discouraging career prospects for most dancers,
yes.
What is it that keeps them dancing?
It's a passion, isn't it? I mean, it's about something inside, I think. And anybody who has been engaged with dance in that way, it's almost like it's a bit of yourself. And if you take that away, one's self-identity is actually quite damaged. So it's a passion for dance, and on the one hand, and the need to do it, and on the other, it's a kind of commitment to perhaps a tradition or to a form of performing as well. So I think it's internal, and there are also external constraints, given that they don't get any money, and they are the poorest paid, really, of all the performers, in fact. And that has been traditionally so, and I don't expect that that has changed.
Thank you. Just move on now to
Yes.
something else, really around the whole question of dance notation. I wonder if you could describe the role of dance notation in choreography and how that then relates to getting performances out of dancers.
Well, dance notation notation is not a huge thing within dance itself, because most choreographers probably don't use notation, and most dancers wouldn't know how to perform by using notation itself. And I think largely it's because it's quite, one is much more embodied, and I think the textual nature of dance notation is quite difficult to translate. I never really got it myself, actually, but there are other kind of systems which are the kind of ways. So within Laban notation, for example, there's also this other form which is qualitative, which is about effort, and it's about the use of weight, space, time and flow in relation to the body, and also to other performers with whom you're working, which I think is much more interesting, because it's qualitative, really. For me, it's much more qualitative, where I think actually notation, and I suppose they would, kind of examples of that would not describe it as so, but I think it's much more quantitative, if I was doing that in a social science type of way. However, having said that, there are quite a lot of works which have been notated, depending on whether it's Benish or Laban notation, or kinetography Laban, as we would call it in the UK. And there are, for example, the major notators themselves, like Anne Hutchinson-Guest, for example, would actually argue that the notation is the dance, and that anything else is an interpretation, but that notation is actually the dance.
So if you were thinking about rights in the construction of a dance, notation would be one way of establishing that those rights existed.
Yeah, and it has been. I mean, certainly the Dance Notation Bureau in New York, for example, I don't really know about Benish, but the lab notation there, you can't, you have to get it's all licensed. A very early modern dancer in America, Doris Humphrey, very cleverly had a lot of her own works notated in lab notation. And that's been quite important in terms of bringing back a tradition, if you like, or making a tradition live in some ways. Although the way it's often been done in the past was it's quite a literal formulation of it. I've seen very bad reconstructions of Doris Humphrey's work, such as the Shakers, for example. I've seen really remarkable work done by Leslie Mayne, who was trained in that tradition, and who has a company that that performs those works. But she does them in really interesting ways, so they're not fixed. So, and certainly in her own PhD, when she kind of developed a piece of Doris Humphrey's work, and but didn't realise that, thought it was the work, but actually it wasn't. And when we showed it to students, all the students said, well, what was that? What was that? They didn't recognise it as that work because she had transformed it. So, and then for me, what happens is she becomes a co-author in that work. So it's not a kind of fixed work anymore. And that's what's more exciting, right. Because what that means is that the dance is a living thing, it's not a dead thing, in the way that I suppose, I mean, I don't really know very much about music, to be honest, but I mean, I suppose that it's, there is a kind of acceptance that there is a kind of interpretation of a score. Although someone like Stravinsky, who I understand was very strict about how that score should be interpreted. But in the old sense of notation, that was not the case. It was you had to do it like that. But it was probably never like that anyway, because the dance will change on each and every occasion on which it's performed.